Adventures on the Gorge presents The Adventure Forum. Adventures on the Gorge Resort sits on the very rim of the New River Gorge, America's newest national park. We have whitewater rafting that can be as mild or as wild as you want. We'll take kids as young as 6, and 6 to 11-year-olds raft free every day all summer long. We have cabins on site, restaurants, zip lining, and a lot more. Plus, we're only a bridge away from the shops and restaurants of Fayetteville. Are you ready for an adventure? Check us out on the web at adventuresonthegorge.com.
All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Adventure Forum. I'm Chris Hayes, your forum host, coming to you live from Adventures on the Gorge on the very rim of the New River Gorge, America's newest national park and preserve. For our viewers who are watching on Zoom or Facebook Live, if you have any questions for our guests, please use the Zoom question and answer function or Facebook comments to submit them at any time. And near the end, we will open the discussion to questions to your questions if we have time. Tonight's forum, which we're calling The Evolution of Rafting, is part 3 of our series on the history of whitewater travel on the New and Gully rivers. 2 weeks ago, part 2 was a great discussion about the early years of commercial whitewater rafting in the New River Gorge. If you missed it, you can still catch it on our website, adventuresonthegorge.com, where you can find the Adventure Forum link near the top of the page. This evening, I am again joined by 3 legends of the whitewater industry. They are the founders or co-founders of rafting companies here in West Virginia. We have Paul Brewer, who is the founder of Mountain River Tours, and we have Dave Arnold and Doug Proctor, who are co-founders of Class 6, and which has evolved into Adventures on the Gorge. So, guys, we're going to hop right in with the questions. Paul, in our last discussion, Tom Dragan mentioned that the first year of operation for Wildwater, a big trip was 18 to 25 guests. And in 1995, in excess of 200,000, I think the number's around 250,000 people rafted in West Virginia, which most of that's probably would have been here in the New River Gorge and on the Gully.
Yep.
What caused that type of growth? I mean, that's pretty explosive. I mean, we're talking doing 1,000 people a day on these rivers now.
Yeah, it was a phenomenal growth, and the baby boomers were the folks that just wanted to get out. They now had some money to travel, and this was brand new. I mean, it's new and exciting thing to do. People hadn't done these things before, and it was a great social get together. So it was just a fun thing to do. Plus, all the owners, and I'm sure Dave and Doug and many others remember that we went to travel shows. We were the ambassadors of West Virginia. We went to Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus, Chicago, Charlotte to promote West Virginia whitewater rafting. We were passionate. They felt our passion about it. And that's what, got these people excited and say, hey, let's go to West Virginia. And it's fun, it's exciting, and it's something new.
Cool. You mentioned the travel shows. Can you tell people what those are? I think a lot of people out there might not know what a travel show is.
Yeah. Basically, you rent out a big exhibition hall, and you would rent a small space within that hall of 10 to 20 feet, and there would be hundreds and hundreds of these people in a travel section promoting their state or their business. And then there would maybe be an associated boat show, an outdoor boat show where they would invite people to come in and just see all the variety of things available for them to do in the travel section, maybe buy a boat. So that was their advertising before, I guess before Google, you might say, or before Facebook. So that was how we got the word out.
Yeah, I worked a couple of those the last few years for Adventures on the Gorge, and I noticed we were the only rafting company at them. So I think that's an interesting trend that which that those were stopped doing those. So I'm going to go on with Doug. I've got a question for you, which is, was gully season always a thing? And for folks out there that don't know what gully season is there's 6 weekends, sometimes 7 weekends, starting in September and ending in October, where the whitewater industry is guaranteed releases from the Summersville Dam to run the Gully River, the optimal whitewater level. But when did that start? Was it always a thing?
Chris, can I ask Doug a specific question? I mean, it goes back to the travel show thing.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I you know.
Are you a turtle, Paul?
Oh, I'll buy you a drink.
Well, what's the answer to that question?
I'll buy you a drink. This is a public forum.
You bet your sweet ass.
Yes, I am. You're right.
Chris, in answer to your question, the New River was really challenging, but I think in the beginning, the Gully was death-defying. There may be a lot of people that don't know, but in the 70s and probably even the early 80s, a lot of people walked Iron Ring. A lot of the kayakers walked Iron Ring. I mean, it was just death-defying. Paul, at Mountain River Tours, you all didn't run suites until what, 1977 or something like that.
77.
I mean,
78,
you did the skirt route on the left. So I think the Gully was more death-defying, but it just, the demand became greater and greater. And one of the things is that the state increased our numbers on the New River and the Gully River. And it, you know, has the Gully always been a thing? It has. One of the things I found the other day was, I don't know, can you see that picture right there? That's Chuck Ludlam. And this is 1998. He had done 20 trips on the Gully, 20 years in a row. So, I mean, we had all these groups that would come year after year after year. And, you know, Chuck started in 1978 with us, lives in DC. So the other thing about the Gully, that how did that modern Gully season come about? One, with politicians and everything, we finally got guaranteed flows on the Gully because we had some problems with that in the 80s. And then also some more access roads were built in there. So it was just easier to
Awesome
to
picture.
do.
There's a great photo, and we give credit for that photo to Whitewater Photography here in Fayetteville, West Virginia.
Yeah, that's the original put-in, and the scenario was, if you could make it out of the put-in, you could make it down the lower gully. I mean, you know, you got in there and you were running what, 5-6 foot waves and horrendous current and so forth. It was a huge challenge to just get out into the flow of the river.
So Doug, so the modern gully season, like I was saying, we get the 6 weekends where we get guaranteed releases. Was there a gully season in the fall prior to that when they were drawn down the lake?
There was in the you know, I started rafting in 77. Class 6 started in 78. Paul, wasn't gully season back then was the first 2 weeks of September?
It was the first 2 weeks of October, yeah, full week.
Yeah, it was later. It was a different season, and the scenario, I don't know, in 84 or 85 was changed to what we have now. So it was different, and but you know, as far as modern gully season, in 1983 and 1988, we had droughts. And we did not get the water that we needed, and eventually the Gully running the river became a project purpose of the dam.
Yeah, we lost 13 in 1988. We lost 13 days out of the 23 days season. Wow. And you know, that was an economic disaster for us and all the industry. And at that time, Governor Rockefeller got us all together in one room with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and to discuss how we could solve this situation. And I remember that we all had small wooden chairs and they brought out one chair. Dave, you might have been there, I don't know, or Doug, but the governor sat on one of the chairs and it fell apart. He fell on the floor. And the Corps of Engineers turned red-faced and said, oh, yeah, well, what do you guys need, so to speak? I mean, you know, I think that was a great precipitation. But one of the questions I have for Dave or Doug is, and we can go into this later, but remember Whitewater Wednesday? And what did that mean to the whitewater industry? You know, there's a lot of nuances there, but anyway, we can talk about that later.
Well, let me add something to the Gully discussion. Maybe I'll touch on that, Paul, or we can come back later. But there's something I think everybody needs to know about Gully before we go any further. And that is that in the very beginning, it wasn't about rafting. It was an accident. Or maybe you could say it was fate.
Yeah.
The Corps of Engineers, which manages Summersville Dam, they were required by law to drain a lot of the lake out in the fall in case there was a flood in the winter or in the spring. And so here's the original outfitters running the New River in the 70s. And all of a sudden, I guess probably the two people that were the keys at discovering it, quote, commercially, was John Dragan and Paul Brewer. So Paul and John started doing experimental trips over there. Doug and I did a trip in 1970 with John Dragan, and you had to interview to get on the Gully. If you were a guest and you wanted to run the Gully, you had to have the guide recommend you, and then John would decide whether you were capable. So this was a chance. This wasn't anything that, you know, that we asked. This was just an opportunity we saw, and we jumped on it. Now, it was kind of interesting because the Corps, because they didn't have a directive to help us, were not very helpful. Yeah. That's how we lost the 13 days Paul was talking about, because we were not a project purpose of the dam. Now, it's a long story and we won't go into details unless somebody wants to know, but basically Congressman Ray Hall and one of his staff, Jim Zoya, changed that. Make a long story short, they got a law passed, signed by Jimmy Carter as president, that directed the Corps to help us. At that point, the Corps started to help us a lot. It wasn't just on guaranteed releases. If you look at the Gully season in the 70s, like Paul said, it was later in the year. If you talk to guides that were running the Gully, you hear them talk about things like frozen valves and trying to get a hairdryer out to unthaw the valves so they could fill up the raft. It wasn't climate change. It was that the season was later. We were pushing late October. And I still remember the meeting, and I'll give credit to Emra for this. We were in a DNR meeting, and at that time, like Paul said, we were running 2 solid weeks straight, which was kind of fun. I mean, we did some 3-day Western style trips on the Gully, which were really neat, but it was not efficient because we would run a lot of people on Saturday and Sunday, and then all during the week, nobody or very few. So Emra at one of the meetings asked the Corps, he said, can we change the operational pattern to Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, then give us 3 days off to recover, get our act together, and then repeat. So that repeat scenario was incredibly helpful to all of us because overnight trips got to restock, guides got to, take a break. So that was a huge change in the Gully industry. And help me if I'm wrong, Paul or Doug, but that was probably middle 80s that changed, maybe late 80s.
Hey, Dave,
Yeah.
there is, Dave, behind Chris's head is the poster that I framed for the meeting at the auditorium in Summersville in July of 1985. Chris, if you move your head, everyone can see that poster. That's where the Whitewater racer guy was talking in there, that preacher.
Yeah. We were referred to as Whitewater racers.
Yeah.
Chris, you see that right behind you?
Yeah.
So do you guys remember when Dolly Parton had a factor in the decision of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers?
Oh, I do, Paul.
Do you remember that?
Oh yeah, the colonel had to go see a show.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And we got out early.
Yeah, yeah. The state director of tourism and I. And did you go along on that trip?
Yeah.
To Huntington to meet the Corps of Engineers, and there was like 3 or 4 of us at the meeting, and there was like 10 Corps of Engineers people, including the chief of hydrology. And we went on for hours, and finally he stood up and said, "I've got tickets to Dolly Parton's conference or concert. This conference is over." You know, remember?
Yeah.
and
I think we got what we wanted, and I'm happy to give Dolly credit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's the bottom line. The bottom line is that Gully works pretty well today, but it was a process that took about 10 years of fine tuning. Even water levels were fine tuned. When we first started running, we just were running the water level that they were letting out, which was somewhere in between 22 and 2300 CFS. And we were getting caught on rocks. And we found that just by going to like 26, it made a huge difference. You know, you just weren't getting caught on all those little rocks. But anyway, 10 years of fine tuning changed the Gully to an operational model that works really, really well. And it's much better for everybody.
Yeah, and one of the things that really brought the Gully, I think, to the forefront was also Canoe Magazine rated the Gully one of the top 10 rivers in the world. That's phenomenal.
I've got a couple of questions.
Can I say one more thing, Chris?
Yeah, sure.
Just another thing about the modern Gully season, a lot of the reason that it came about was the guests' connection to the guides. Yeah. I just got a text from one of my best friends, George McMurray, saying guides' lives matter. But Chuck Ludlam, who did 20 trips in a row, George guided him 19 of those trips. He was coming back for the river. He was also coming back for that guide. So they had a lot to do, the guides, with the modern Gully season.
Yeah.
So we've got a couple of questions coming in from our guests or our viewers pertaining to the Gully. And since we're kind of on that subject, I'm going to go ahead and ask those. One of them I've got from a fellow named Kevin. He's asking, do you think there will ever be a longer Gully season?
You know, the water flow, it depends on the water flow in the amount of water in Summersville Lake. But I think it also depends a lot on weather. So I'm not sure that'll happen. What do you think, Dave?
Well, I think you're right, Paul. I mean, it's just a matter of water as far as simple math, but politics is such that you got to remember this is set in law by passage of both the United States Senate and the House and signed by the President of the United States. To change it, that has to change, and that is not easy to do. So I don't see a major change happening. And to tell you the truth, you know, at least in the foreseeable future that I see, it's just icing on the cake for us. It's what makes being an outfitter so awesome here, because you got such a great river in your backyard, such a great river in your front yard, and you have an extended season. Most outfitters, like where Doug operates in Idaho on the Selway, their season's over. You know, when we go all the way into late October, so I doubt it.
The other questions I've got regarding the Gully, this one's from Joe Beth. It is, how did changing from bucket boats to self-bailers change your approach to the Gully? Did it immediately feel less death-defying, to use Paul's words?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Made the guys' jobs a lot easier.
The other question,
Chris, I remember the first day I had a bailer on the Upper Gully, a self-bailer, and it was like, I mean, I was scared at the put-in. It's something new. I was like, they're like, hey, we got one of these. Who's going to take it? And all the other guys were freaked out by it. And they're like, you take it, Dave. I'm going, I don't know if I want to. And they're like, no, you're taking it. So, but when it was over, it was pretty obvious that it changed. That was a technological change that changed everything. I mean,
Yeah.
I can guarantee you Paul Brewer and Doug remembers going through Lost Paddle, going through second drop, trying to eddy out above Tumble Home. And when you stood up, the water was up to your neck. You know, the last discussion you guys had, Emra talked about the technological change of going from gallon milk jugs to 5-gallon pickle buckets.
Yeah.
That sounds funny, but that was a real change. I mean, it was huge. And then all of a sudden, self-bailers came about, and the game was over. The bucket game was over. This sounds a little, I don't know. I almost hate to say this, but it's true. It was harder to run a trip back then. You know, a boat full of water at second drop was a major consequence. And I think that's why people can run higher water levels now. You know.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, it's technologically, it's going from a gas light to electric lights, you know.
Yeah.
And if you don't have 1,000 or 2,000 pounds of water in your boat, you know, you're able to control that boat a lot better with the people you have with you. So it's huge. Yeah.
And then one last question on the Gully. And it's sort of along the same lines of what Joe Beth asked. This is from Alex coming to us on Facebook. We kind of touched on his first two questions, which is better equipment. Dave, you talked a little bit earlier about the better water levels, finding the better water levels made a difference. And then his last question on it is kind of, was there any flood change in the river or in the rapids that made it less death-defying seeming?
I don't remember
No.
any changes. I do remember going back to the bucket boat versus self-bailer was that, you know, one of the things we worked with the Corps of Engineers was below the Meadow River, we could run higher levels. Remember, we could do like 1,800 from the dam down to Meadow, and then 4,500, which was huge, on down with self-bailer boats. And I don't know. Do you guys recall anything? Iron Ring. I don't recall anything changing there, or Shiprock, or any of those, or even Lost Paddle. You know, the mile-long Lost Paddle was.
You know, guides have for 40, 50 years I've been on the river have talked about how the river changes, and there are rivers. Grand Canyon is a great example of that. I mean, Grand Canyon has dramatic changes in rapids because of side flow coming in, but the truth of the matter is that both on the New and the Gully, any change because of the topography of the river, the movement of rocks is very minor. We've never seen a major change. Doesn't mean we might see it someday, but it's not happened in our lifetimes.
Good question. Good question.
One more thing, Glenn Goodrich, another legend in the whitewater industry,
You mean the
has.
Gully?
He doesn't have a question so much, but he's just got more of a stay. He says, I have a journal. Early Gully started the third weekend of September and usually ran 16 days. Must have suggested the 4-day weekend scenario in 1981 because 1982 was the first that we had that. We had 7 days of full blown in 1983 and only 2 days in 1988. It became priority purpose in 1989.
There you go, guys.
Yeah.
That's the official record. By the way, Glenn Goodrich is still guiding on the Grand Canyon, trip leading. He guides here at Gully season mainly.
Yep.
And he may correct me, but I think he's got over 100,000 miles of whitewater rafting. And interesting enough, his background, which is in journalism from Ohio State University.
Yeah.
By the way, Glenn, I think Glenn will tell you, I was the first person to take him on the Gully. I guided him when he was a kid. I think he was with his parents. I'm sure he'll text you in a minute and tell you. But one thing about Glenn's comment, he is correct. The Gully started and there was a 2-week flow, but there was also weekends. I can't remember how many, Paul, do you remember? But it wasn't just 2 weeks of flow. That 2 weeks would be 16 days, but we got another, what was it, 2 weekends after that, or maybe 3 weekends.
Yeah, initially, yeah. And you know, one of the things that really brought us all together was this Whitewater Commission. You know, it was very unique, and we could sit around a table and discuss the issues. And one of the things that one of the future engineers said, we need the facts. So that's when they started looking into, you know, the loads in the Canal River and all the flows and what flow was in there, and do what we call reverse pulsing. In other words, they would give during the day, they would give us 25 or 2,600 CFS. In the evening, you know, they'd blow it up to, you know, 5 or 6, 10,000 even to keep the water flows. It was really accommodating to a huge economic boost to the local economy. So it was a great cooperation once we understood all the facts, you know.
All right, so we're gonna move on a little bit here. Dave, this is a question for you. Would you mind telling us about how the Tays Landing takeout came about?
Sure. And I'm sure Paul and Doug probably want to add something to this, but you know, Paul's talking about cooperation, and there was amazing cooperation on the Gully. Again, I give the number one credit goes to Congressman Ray Hall, but there were so many people that helped. The story of Tays is also a story of cooperation. John Dragan basically owned the only takeout that was viable for large numbers. There were people doing some silly things like roping boats up Fayette Station, you know, literally some kind of a pulley system to pull boats up. And there was a lot of silly stuff. But the takeout below Fayette Station that John Dragan and Whitewater owned was the most viable and the only one that worked for large scale. So John decided to make his money in real estate. And Tom sort of, if you remember last meeting, laughed about that. He said, yeah, after Tays was built, we lost a serious chunk of our income. Yeah. And the story is pretty simple. We started looking at how much money we were paying to take out there, and we figured out that we could build our own takeout. And we took it to a banker by the name of Bud Hill. And Bud Hill listened to us pitch it, and he listened to us and he just said, hey, you're right. You guys can finance this with your lease payment. Now, who were the people? The people were the 4 largest outfitters. It was Appalachian, which was Emerson Lodge, was on the last forum. It was Paul, it was Class 6, Doug and I, Jeff, and Kevin, and it was Frank Lucas from NAR. And still to this day, I think it's probably one of the greatest combinations of participation. We were competitors. We were all friendly, but we were pretty strong competitors. You know, we were all young bucks. We're talking about 84 when we got it finished. So, you know, this is early in the game. And the interesting thing is each one of us brought a talent to it, which made the fruition happen, and it was a good thing. Emra knew our past governor, Archmore, who played a very large role in this. Paul did the engineering. He knew the people in the engineering department. We, the Class 6 boys, knew the landowners, the Taylor family. And Frank had a friend who worked with the railroad. I think it was actually one of his guide's fathers was key in the railroad. But the bottom line is all 4 of us put the pedal to the metal, and, you know, the balls were on the line, pardon my French. We had the steel delivered to the site before we had permission to build it. Matter of fact, Paul, you probably took that call. Said, what on earth are you doing? Well, the bottom line was we put it all on the line. If we hadn't got it, we would have been in serious financial trouble, all 4 of us.
Couple things.
On top of it, John would have put it to us.
Yeah.
But
absolutely.
Go ahead, Paul.
Absolutely. But Tays Landing is access under main line of the Chessie system. Okay. Amtrak ran this line. I mean, coal, millions of dollars went over this line. And we were proposing to put a 16-foot diameter tunnel, 92 feet long, under the main line of the Chessie system. Now you can imagine what that would do to the engineers and the railroad. And you know, we said, hey, we can do this. And they said, who are you? You know, how can you guys do this? So we, you know, worked this from many different angles, and finally convinced them that they would give us 72 hours to dig a 20-foot wide hole. We moved 72 feet of track out of the way, dug this hole. And specifically, Doug, you can tell us, what did we hit in the middle of this hole? It was a huge rock. and you knew the guy that blew it apart, right?
Yeah.
Who was that guy? I forget his name.
I forget. No,
But
I forget.
I mean, we did it in 58 hours. We went 24 hours. Doug was there bringing food down, and what a cooperation. It was just huge. And we brought 16 truckloads, 20-ton truckloads of rock to put on top of this, you know, what they call a hinge effect. It would basically buckle the tunnel if we did not put this gravel underneath it. Beautiful picture. That's 16 feet in diameter, so you could get a school bus through it. That's how we designed it. There it is, 92 feet long, 16 feet in diameter. It's made out of E20 galvanized steel. Loading is made in Middletown, Ohio, and shipped here before we had the permit. Can you imagine, Dave? Remember Cincinnati? Remember the Cincinnati show? Tell us, remember, you can probably remember it better than I do. What happened?
No, go ahead.
You know, we decided to do it. We didn't have anything on it. We were like cutting the limb off, and we were on the wrong side of the limb.
Yeah, exactly. Here's a quick story about it that's pretty amazing. I feel comfortable telling this story because it is in Arch Moore's biography. I got a call and asked by the guy who was writing it if I would tell him this story. And I said, not without Governor Moore's approval. And he said, well, call the governor and ask him. And I called the governor. He said, yeah, tell the story. I love it. It's one of my favorite stories. I also was at Governor Moore's funeral, and they talked about it at the funeral. We were denied, here's the story. We were denied putting it in. I'm in a meeting, a note handed in front of me that says the Corps declined the tunnel. Well, as you can imagine, you know, I mean, my heart stopped because that had huge consequences. About 10 minutes later, I get a note put in front of me that says the Corps has decided to allow you to do the tunnel.
The railroad.
The railroad. I'm sorry, the railroad said you could do the tunnel. So the director of DNR was chairing the meeting. He said, do you need a recess? And I said, yeah. So I went and called, and the president of the CSX Railroad denied it. Governor Moore was our attorney. He wasn't the governor at the time. He was just a lawyer, perfectly legit, nothing weird about the deal. He was representing us. And he said on the phone call to the president of CSX, that's fine, you can deny it. The score is Arch Moore 0, CSX 1. And about 20 minutes later, they called him back and said, we don't like that score. You can put the tunnel in. True story.
Yep.
You mentioned the huge consequences. What were those huge consequences?
Well, maybe bankruptcy. I mean, all four of us had our butts on the line. We had all the, like I said, we delivered the steel to the site. We bought the steel. We did all the engineering. And this is also, I think we can talk about this. John Dragan was very clear that he was going to put it to us. He scared the hell out of Doug and I one night. That, you know, Doug figured out that we'd be spending, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars in takeout fees right now if we had that agreement. And he made it very clear that if we didn't, you know, back off of this tunnel, that he was going to jump that lease rate higher. So it was very scary, which made for a great party afterwards when we cut the ribbon. There was one heck of a party at the tunnel.
It was.
Hundreds of people there, seriously.
Yeah. One of the supports that we did have was that the National Park Service in the National Recreation Area, the New River Recreation Area, was created. You remember Jim Carrico, the superintendent at the time, said this is part of the management plan.
Yep. Yes.
So that was a plus in our camp to get it done. And we could do it a lot less time and less money than the government. So that was big boost.
This is another thing that's kind of sidebar, but this comment may surprise people. I think the best thing that ever happened to our industry is that we had to put in at Thurman. When we first started, Cunard didn't exist. I mean, not only did it not exist, but it wasn't even on our radar. Because we put in at Thurman, the New River became a long one-day trip, which gave guides a lot of time to interact with their guests. It created what's here today. And as you recall from the past forums, Wildwater came from the Yacht. It could have very easily, let's just say Cunard was open and was feasible in the beginning. The industry could have become Yacht-like, meaning, you know, guides would be running 2 and 3 times a day, and there would never be a long version. So one of the other things about the Tays tunnel is once Cunard came into play, it extended the river trip another hour and 3 rapids or two rapids. So Tays tunnel also helped with product development, I think.
Yeah.
And it also, this is really important. When you were talking, Chris, about the growth, we never could have done the 250,000 people without Tays. Yeah. The tunnel allowed 2 takeouts, and it allowed the numbers to happen. Without it, that never would have happened.
All right. I've got a couple of updates from Glenn Goodrich. It says it's only 75,000 miles, Paul.
Oh, darn.
And then he said, Dave, you were his first guide on the New River. You were his first guide.
Jeff Proctor
was his first guide on the Gully.
Gotcha.
There you go.
Good. That's good to know.
Doug, at what point in the industry did family-friendly rafting become a thing?
I think it was a demographics and age that the boomers were all coming rafting in the late 70s and 80s. And all of a sudden they started getting married and having kids. And outfitters saw that. And, you know, the family market, I think, really took off around 1994, 1995. And it was the Upper New. I mean, we were hardly even doing anything on the Upper New, but that's when that product really started coming out. And even not even only the Upper New, but Lower New. I mean, how many times a year can I bring a 12-year-old? Can I bring a 10-year-old? Can I bring a 9-year-old? And it had to do with the boomers getting married and having kids, I think.
So you think that switching over to a little more family-friendly rafting helped that boom in the mid 90s?
Oh yeah, you know, we it's still a question today. 1995, the whole industry, and I know Class 6 grew about 25 to 30%, and whether it was the River Wild, but
I think it was Meryl Streep did a lot to do this.
Yeah, and you know, that would be my thing. It was just an age thing, and people were having kids, and the kids were coming on the Upper New, and then boom, they come on the Lower New. What, Paul and Dave, what do you think about that?
Well, first off, there's no question Meryl Streep changed a lot. That movie. And by the way, if you go back to the very beginning, in 1972, the growth was caused by a movie also, which was Deliverance. You know, you had 3 stars lined up in 72. You had the major movie about running a river, even though there was, you know, a bad theme to it. It was still about running a river. You also had kayaking in the Olympics in 72 at Munich. You had a bronze champion in kayaking, an American, which was unheard of because the Europeans dominated it. And you had a technological change in that you had plastic boats starting to pop, and the fiberglass boats were on their way out. Took them a couple of years, but so you had a big boom happen in 72, and you had a big boom happen with the Meryl Streep movie. And the reason why, like Paul's was so confident in Doug and I, it affected all outfitters, not just us. It didn't matter if you were, running, whatever, the middle fork of the salmon, it affected them all. So yeah, I think our business was built on boomers, and then that big growth was built on boomers' children with the boomers. The real question is, why did it fall apart? I have my theories on that, but the industry obviously in 95 and 2000 peaked. What caused us to go from 200 and, like you said, 50,000, 225 down to 100,000 today? I mean, that is a huge loss.
Yeah.
Well,
I think it was
Dave, were we going back to just a limit of 40 people per trip? Is that what you wanted to do? Is that?
Yeah, you were right. In what Paul's talking about in 1978, we were probably, I mentioned in an email to Paul, and I think you were on that, Chris, too, that we were probably more river guides than business people. And we're still all river guides, but the percentages probably changed a little. And we were pretty idealistic, and we fought for one, Dragan fought for each outfitter having one trip, and you got a half an hour block. You got a half hour. You could put in at Thurman from 7:30 to 8, done. We fought for having 2 trips of 40. And now what do we run now? A big day, 16, 17 trips.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've come a long way.
Paul, do you see any differences in the rafters and the type of people that are coming rafting from when you first started to today's rafters?
Yeah, I haven't been out there the last couple of years a lot, but yeah, I do. And I think Dave has been involved and others, and Doug, you're still active. But I think initially, the people that came with us, the younger baby boomers, were very active, really into it, and willing to participate a lot and willing to learn and learn with us, because we were really learning as we were going a lot of times. But now I think, and it's not a bad thing at all. I think it's in some ways it's good, but people want to be more entertained, if you will. So that's the difference, and I think the population is not quite as in shape as they used to be, honestly. From what I remember, and we were having a lot of people help us lift rafts and stuff, and nowadays that doesn't particularly happen as much. What do you guys think, Dave, Doug?
Doug?
Well, that's a feeling among a lot of guides that, we're just, our clientele has gotten softer. And that, I don't know if it's that idea that anybody can do it, where it was in 1980, it was death defying to go on the Gully.
Yeah.
You fall out in the iron ring, you could be in the hole forever. And now it's anyone can do it. So it's made that change with the industry, and we see all walks coming with us.
I think a lot of the press, Chris, a lot of the media that came about made it more mainstream. In the beginning, in the 70s, early 70s especially, there were a lot of Volkswagen vans, and today there's a lot of Lexus. The fact that all the press that came about, and there have been, we see more press today than we've ever seen with the national park, but there was also a big, like I said, in 72 after the Olympics, there was Sports Illustrated ran a big article about Walt Blackadare running Turnback Canyon. Well, Sports Illustrated was all about basketball and football. It was radical that they would have a huge article on running rivers. So as it got more mainstream, we saw more people from the general population. We're still pretty white. We see more diversity, but we certainly, one of the saviors in the next 10 years is going to be, can we get more diversity in our clients and our guide staff? But we'll see if that happens.
I mean, the raft trip is just a very unique way to see nature's beauty, the only way to see it a lot of times, and feel the presence and the power of the river, and just the spectacular formation of a river. I still get enthusiastic talking about it and feel that energy that, when you run to Kenny's, or when what Tom said the other day, when you turned that corner and saw Whale Rock, a rock big as a whale in the middle of the river, and you turned and you knew that was going to drop 80 feet in 3 rapids. And as a guide, your adrenaline was pumping, and the people in your raft felt it. It's there. It's still there. Yeah.
It is. I know that feeling. Dave, at one point there were 26 rafting companies on the Gully, and nowadays there are 7. But how did those numbers fall like that?
Well, first off, I would guess it was probably more than 26, but that's a good number. The number was very large, and obviously there's just less than a third of the companies that started. There's a lot of people that wouldn't even remember Leonard Cox from American Whitewater, or Jim Grimmeth, or some of the owners that Paul would remember, and Doug, and there were outfitters that nobody even remembers. They don't even remember the owners anymore.
Remember Barry O'Mahony?
Barry, there were a bunch of them. Basically, what happened was, I hate to say this, but my wife was a science teacher, and she always had a big sign in her room that said, "Adapt, migrate, or die. This is the law of nature." And there just wasn't enough money. This is a game of low margins. The whitewater outfitting industry has low margins. It's like, lots of things have low margins, and a lot of people just didn't make it. A number of people went bankrupt. We sat in, I think, Paul, you were there. I know you were, Doug. A guy that, again, most people probably don't even remember, named Randy Jenkins, who went bankrupt. And in federal bankruptcy court, we watched the federal bankruptcy judge, Judge Ron Pearson, take the company apart and sell it right there in front of all of us. We bought different pieces of it. Randy, because my family had gone through a bankruptcy many years ago, I went up to Randy afterwards and I said, "Randy, I really feel for you. I'm sorry you had to go through this." And he had an amazing answer. He said to me, "I should have just bought a raft." What he meant by that, he really wasn't prepared to run a rafting company. He fell in love with the industry, got a permit, he ran. But the bottom line is mergers, acquisitions, bankruptcies. I don't know if I'm missing anything, but they filed it down to 7. And, I think 7's a good number. There's plenty of competition out there. There's big guys and little guys, and they both provide services that are needed and have unique niches. But, it was tough. This is not an easy business to be in. And they got shut down.
Well, don't you think, Dave, that the people's needs have changed over the years? I mean, the resort factor, where you have zip lines and you have different activities, and you've got, you guys built Smokies. I mean, you blew us away when you built Smokies there, and, those types of restaurants. But many different activities going on is what people are looking for.
Yeah.
And time and money, both people, the shorter span seems to be what's going on. That's the progression that we're seeing. So
there were a lot of great people in the industry that are now gone, and they were colorful. I mean, we don't have time for stories, and I won't go there, but they were very colorful. And it's because it was an entrepreneurial venture at the very gut level. Most of the people in this industry were being fed on passion, not on cash. Yeah. And they just, Barry and Leonard Cox and Jim Grimmeth and Beauty Mountain River Tours. I mean, there were just some real characters, and they just weren't prepared to be business people, but they ran some really fun rafting companies.
Yeah. Well, just like you, Dave, what did you study when you were going to school, and where did you wind up? I mean, Doug the same way, and Jeff, and a lot of these people.
Yeah, my wife and I were pre-med. We were going to med school, but it didn't. We did it, like you said. It was all about passion.
Yeah, I was going to go into farming, raising corn stalks or something. I don't know. You
Yeah.
know. Crazy. I don't know what, Doug, what were you going to go into? I never could figure you out.
Well, I took business and accounting.
Yeah.
So, who did the books in class 6? Anytime I could get on the river to hang out with the guests and the guides, I wanted to. I'd rather be there than in the office.
Yeah. Are you still putting cream pies in people's faces on their birthday?
Yeah.
No, I haven't done that in a long time.
Oh,
I
man.
figure there's probably something in our culture that says you can't do that. So.
All right. Paul, if you could have a do-over, what would you do? What would you do differently?
Oh man, there's a song. I have a few regrets, but a few too many to mention, I think, is the song. You just, like Dave said, you work and you work and you work your ass off and you persist and you go after it, but you get that feeling in you. It's like Glenn Goodrich, 75,000 miles of Whitewater. I mean, there's many other guides like that, and we could have chosen many different careers, but it's that adrenaline. It's taking people down a river and knowing that you're going through a class 5 rapid, which is it's a dangerous thing, and the skills and the camaraderie between the guides and the people and the whole family atmosphere is just gravitating and pulling you into something that you just can't get away from. It seems like in your life, it's your whole life. I mean, you put your whole life into it.
So I don't know if you guys can see, we've been joined by Glenn Goodrich. Like I said, another one of the legends in the whitewater industry. How you doing, Glenn?
Good, great.
You're not on a river somewhere?
No, Salt River didn't run, so.
No. Gotcha. Well, welcome.
Salt River's in where, Arizona, I think.
Yeah. There's no water this year, so a later start.
Gotcha.
Great to see you, Glenn.
Yeah, thanks.
Are you guiding on the Grand Canyon again this year?
Yeah, I got 2 trips in May and 1 in August.
Awesome.
Yep.
Cool.
Awesome. Are you going to be here for Gully season, or?
Of course.
You better be.
By the way, you've got a reservation in our campground. So
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, so I graduated in computer science, and I always tell my guests that I decided there was no future in that, and so I became a river guide.
Great story. Love it. Yeah.
It is definitely interesting to see all the different backgrounds. I was a finance guy. I got a degree in finance. And here I am being a river operations manager, and after spending years as a guide.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff and Dave, where do you? I'm sorry, Doug and Dave. Where do you guys see the whitewater rafting industry in 10 years?
I'll start. I'll tell you, that's a really hard question. Whenever you're predicting the future, you're just being an idiot. So, but you asked, and 10 years is a long time.
Yeah, that is. Let's say 5 years then. 5 years.
Even 5 years is a long time. One thing I can tell you, I believe there will be growth. There are things that no matter how much money we spend on marketing, no matter how aggressive we were, there were times in our history where we had a jump, and they were all caused by outside factors. I mentioned 72 with the Olympics, with who was it? McEwen winning the bronze, with Deliverance, with Burt Reynolds, then we had obviously Meryl Streep and River Wild. There's always these outside factors that create growth. To me, there is no question that the game has changed with COVID. COVID is making people look at rural America. They're making people realize that maybe living in a downtown urban environment is not the best place to be. Top it off with us getting the national park named. somebody told me Roger counted 75 articles, and we're not talking about the little articles. We're talking about Forbes and Wall Street Journal and New York Times, Outdoor Life, the big dogs, and it's just cascaded down to so many. So I think we're at a turning point. I think we're at a trigger point, and there's going to be growth. There's always, if there's multiple things, it's even better. One of the changes that I think will happen is when the Hatfield-McCoy Trail hooks into Fayetteville, Oak Hill, I think that will also be a trigger. So I think we're going to see growth in the next 5 years that we haven't seen. I do think the days of 225, 250 commercial rafters, we will never see again. And maybe that's why there was decline. Maybe there were too many. Maybe people thought it was too crowded. Maybe people said, well, the whole raft 'em hard thing, is wrong. I got scared. There were a bunch of things probably that were triggers that caused the decline. But I think I see growth happening right now. And I would bet, $1 on a nickel that there's going to be some pretty serious growth. What am I talking about? I don't know if you can quantify it, but I think 20 to 40% growth in the next 10 years is easy. And that may not sound like very much, but you got to remember, since 2000, we've seen zero growth in the rafting industry. It's nothing but down. So I'm very, very optimistic.
Doug, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, probably one of the key things in all these, 40 or 50 years is having a great staff. And those guides, as long as they do a really good job and care about the river and their guests and are passionate about it, I think the industry is going to continue to grow. But it really takes the whole staff leading their guests down that path. I'm with Dave on the COVID. Unfortunately, it was a hard thing on the country, but it got a lot of people in the outdoors. And I think it's critical that the millennials and the younger generations and the different populations buy into outdoors for the industry to stay constant or even grow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really support, and I totally agree with what Dave and Doug are saying, totally. But if you think back, and Dave, you were really involved with tourism, state tourism, a number of years back in the 80s. And how the state of West Virginia was really out there. Honestly, I don't see that right now. And I think that's the other part of the puzzle. This is a big puzzle, and that's one of the key pieces to me is the state has to get out there, has to get passionate about it and help us, the tourism industry, because what is it? Every dollar that's spent by a tourist stays here 7 times or whatever that is. But wouldn't you agree the state just gotta go for it here?
No question. For West Virginia to grow, we will play a major part in that. And I think our governor presently and our governors in the past have realized that, we are the ambassador. I say this sometimes, we're the sexy dress. The economy is based on a lot of things, but, rafting, skiing, the outdoor sports, that's what really makes it interesting. That's what makes people, I said this a number of times. If you're on an airplane and you're sitting next to somebody, and if you say, hey, I'm Dave, I'm from West Virginia, if they've been rafting or they've been skiing or something, they will turn into you. I mean, they will literally turn into you and say, oh my God, that was one of the greatest things I ever did. I can't, let me tell you about the time I went. If they haven't done that, they'll actually lean away from you, like there's something wrong with you. So, I think I think the state plays an incredible role. I also want to say what Doug said. I've stood in front of our staff for 30 years and asked them who we represent. And I've always said we represent, people would say to me, well, we represent the company. I'd say, well, that's a good question, good answer. They would say, hey, I represent myself, good answer. But really, every guide, every store person, every waitress, they represent West Virginia every single day. We are changing how people see things, and bless people like Glenn, who have just done unbelievable jobs. You mentioned George Murray. I mean, some of the greatest humans on earth are in this business. I would much rather sit around a campfire with a bunch of river guides than anybody else. We have a really special thing, and people, the growth comes because this is a people business, and our passion goes to the guests, and that you can't measure that, and it's huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, Glenn, I'm going to go back to one of your comments that you had on the question and answer part about you loved telling the history of below Thurman, that you did use Kennard as a private access. You just had to pay Sleepy $5. But tell us.
No, but that was the best history part of the New River, was that section, past Fire Creek Pool and all that. I love telling stories there.
And who was Sleepy?
Sleepy was a guy right at the top of Kennard, right as right on the corner. There was a little trailer still there. He had a sign said shuttles $5, and you could take your kayak or your rolled up raft and hop in the back of his pickup truck, and for $5 he'd take you down that 4-wheel drive road, which is now the Kennard Access.
Huh. Cool. All right. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap things up here, guys. Glenn, I wish you would have been able to join us a little bit earlier. I think that would have been great. But, if we didn't get to everybody's questions, I would apologize for that. Please join us for our next Adventure Forum on Wednesday, March 31st at 7:30. The subject is going to be raft guide training. And thank you once again to all of our panelists, Paul, Dave, Doug, and Glenn. Thanks for joining. And to all of our viewers out there, thank you for joining us. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will see you next time. This is Chris Hayes signing off from Adventures on the Gorge.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. It's great seeing you, Glenn.